Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Fireside chat by CII Co. In fact, it's the first Fireside chat by us, and very excited to be here and hosting this. During the lockdown in last 4 5 months, we have had several such webinars where we covered a range of topics and problem statements, range of panel discussions. This time, we are planning a series of one-to-one conversations with experts who are the best at what they do. I'm Snehil, your host for today, and maybe without wasting much time, let me welcome our guest for today, Bharat Vishwesvaraya, who is Director Investments at Omidia Network India. Welcome, Bharat.
Thanks so much, Snehal. Great to be here.
Yeah. A little introduction about Bharat. Of course, he's one of the leading impact investors in the country right now. His speciality ranges across a wide gambit of areas, but primarily his efforts in creating an ecosystem, they are centered around civic tech, governance, citizen engagement. He has also recently led some investments in independent media. Also focuses on legal tech and property tech, just to name a few areas. And maybe Bharat, you can talk more about them as we move ahead. Also, a little bit about Omidia Network. I'm sure we don't need any introduction about that. But one of the leading impact investors in the country and have invested more than $300 million in last few years across several organizations. Um, right. So let's get going. And today's talk is centered around civic tech. What we would want to get from Bharat today is firstly, we would try to understand what civic tech is, try to understand what all subsectors or areas it covers, it entails. Secondly, we'll go to explore how to build a new or nascent sector like this. And after that, finally, we'll close it by taking a look into the future, uh, just trying to understand what we can expect from a sector like civic tech in the next 2 to 3 to 5 years. Bharat, just to set up the context, last year, CIICO, Village Capital, Omidyar Network, we released a joint report on catalyzing civic tech in India. And in that, the primary objective was to define what a new sector like civic tech is in Indian context. We gave a very simple explanation where we said that civic tech startups can cater either to government or they can cater to citizens. If they are serving the governments, then they are either working at the front end in ensuring efficient delivery of services, be it in waste management, water, sanitation, mobility, whatever. At the same time, they are also working at the back end to boost digitization, uh, faster working at the back end in different across municipalities, ULBs, several government ministries, etc. Um, but at the same time, if we look at civic tech abroad, often we see that they lay a lot of focus on gov tech as a separate sector. When they talk about civic tech, they would rather talk more about citizen engagement or even peer-to-peer sharing uh, to that extent. So, in terms of India, and probably just to cut long story short, in the context of India, where internet penetration and technology penetration is day by day increasing, at the same time, inefficiencies of government are also there at several levels. How would you define civic tech, and what all does it contain? Yeah.
Yeah, no, great question, Snehal, and thanks for that. Thanks for having me here, first of all. Um, I think that, broadly, the definitions of civic tech are pretty sort of similar to what you just described. But essentially, when we step back and we think about it from an Omidyar network perspective, essentially we look at the whole sort of the relationship between citizens and the government, which obviously encompass a number of different areas. And we say, what are tools and technologies that can be used to both to essentially improve that interface, between citizens and government. So anything that either citizens rely on government help or support for, things that might involve, applying to the government for permissions or licenses or what have you, all of those become fair game, right? And it's fairly agnostic of what type of problem someone is looking to solve. So as you mentioned, it could be in transportation, it could be in pollution, it could be in pretty much any other number of areas. But as long as it maintains that basic sort of linkage between the citizens on the one end and government on the other, that's what we would think of as being part of civic tech. And you're right that GovTech also is often sort of encompassed in the same space, and which again the reason for doing that is because many of these applications that serve government are really being provided in order to be able to improve service delivery of some kind to citizens. So, for example, one of the long-standing investments that we have in this space or partnerships is with an organization called the E-Governments Foundation, which essentially provides technology to help municipalities digitize all of their operations. Right. So, if you think of a local government which has to do things like picking up the garbage, it has to issue birth and death certificates, they have to issue trade licenses to traders. All of those things need a system to help them function a lot more smoothly, right? And so those are all in our minds really good examples of civic tech, which can really make the lives of citizens a lot smoother by improving the interaction between citizens and government.
Okay. Now, Bharat, I mean, very rightly, aptly explained. When it comes to either engagement or efficient delivery of services or improving the lives of people as such, how critical is technology in governance right now? Is it there to substitute the previous methods of governance? Is it there to supplement or complement? Is it absolutely essential, such that without any new tech interventions, citizens are expecting maybe much more from their governments? What is your take on that?
Yeah. No, our sense is that technology is, especially as the penetration of technology increases, as you alluded to in your opening comments as well, as that penetration increases, certainly technology becomes a very important enabler. It can dramatically reduce costs of access. It can dramatically improve access to services, and therefore, we are starting to see technology as fairly central. Of course, at one level, one could argue that nothing is absolutely something without which one cannot do business and so on, right? So I wouldn't go that far, but certainly it is key to be able to improve access, to be able to increase efficiency of the delivery of services. So in all of those dimensions, I think certainly in our experience over the last couple of years, we have seen it playing a central role. At the same time, I would caution that the digital divide is a real one. Often when we think about government services in particular, and maybe civic tech more generally as well, really who you have to keep in mind is this audience that we at Omidia Network call the next 500 million. These are people who are not yet on the internet or who are just starting to get onto the internet, which is a proxy for people who are traditionally disadvantaged, right? And the reason we think that is important is because that's where the digital divide is often the most pronounced. So we think that anyone that's working on a civic tech solution, even though technology is obviously front and center, need to be thinking about that population as well and what it is that they can be doing to access the product or the service. So again, to give you a couple of examples, with the E-Governments Foundation, one of the things we found in a recent piece of research that we did, it's not yet public, hopefully it will be in the next month or so, is that often citizens will use physical intermediaries to be able to access even a technology channel. So they might go to, let's say, a non-profit that is based in their community, or they might go to a political leader that's based in their community or that they know really well, and use them as a mechanism or an intermediary to be able to access technology. So one needs to be thinking about these kinds of intermediaries and thinking about what it can, how it is that the person at the last mile who is often a little bit cut off from technology, might not understand technology really well. How is it that they can also access the product or services being offered?
Right. In your experience in last 2 to 5 years, in your experience of observing civic tech solutions and use cases of technology in governance, what changes have you observed, if there are any, and what evolution have you seen during this time?
Yeah. No, I think we've seen quite dramatic changes actually. So again, sticking with the E-Governance Foundation example, when we first started partnering with them, they were in a few dozen urban local bodies or ULBs as they're called, which are basically cities and small towns across the country. They are now at something like close to 1,800 or so. Let's call it 2,000, which is roughly about half of all cities and towns that we have in India. So that is dramatic penetration that has happened. And bear in mind that, this level of sophisticated technology is something that these city governments have had to put in a lot of effort to get used to. Right? So that environment, I think, has really gotten very clearly established over the last few years, where governments are clear that, this is, as I was saying earlier, it's central to the efficiency of their services. It's central to the ability of citizens to be able to access these services. And so the governments have also made that evolution to actually be able to embrace technology of this kind. So I think it's been quite a dramatic change that has happened. And even when we look at some of the operating parameters, the number of grievances being filed by citizens, or in other words, the usage of these applications by citizens, they've grown by leaps and bounds in the last few years. Payments of property taxes on a technology platform, those again have grown quite dramatically. Or even internally within the government, you look at their use of dashboards or other such solutions being provided by the platform as a way to improve the efficiency of their own working. All of those things have grown quite dramatically in the last few years. So I think a lot of sort of positive signs there.
Okay. You gave the example of e-governments. Now, e-government foundation is there for a long time. It's a large organization right now. If we see from a startup lens, especially from emerging startup lens, how would you rate the maturity of the civic tech ecosystem in India? Is it nascent? Is it growing? How far does it need to go still?
Yeah, I'd still look at it as being fairly young and nascent at this point. I think in some areas, perhaps it's coming a little bit closer to, at least starting to get out of that nascent stage. But overall, I definitely think it would still be at the nascent stage. And some of the reasons for that are, I think, one is the maturity of the overall sector in terms of the readiness of governments to accept solutions. Those things are just starting to happen. Right? As I was saying, the government has been on that journey over the last few years now. And when I say government, it's not one monolithic body. It's sort of governments at different levels: the union government, state governments, local governments, and so on. All of them have been on that journey, and therefore, I think the readiness is starting to come about. I definitely think that, looking forward, I do think that there is still a lot of ground to cover, which is why I would still say that, overall it's at a nascent stage, but certainly looking quite interesting and attractive at this point.
Okay. And one question which I definitely want to ask is it a startup play at all? Given that we see a lot of non-profits operating in civic tech, and also a lot of omidia's investments have also been into non-profits. That makes one think that if, as an entrepreneur, you want to create an impact in this sector, maybe a non-profit model is more likely to succeed. Is it wise to believe in this hypothesis, or do you still think that for-profits do have a place in this?
Yeah, it's to be honest, I think one of the reasons that it's still a nascent sector, Snehal, is because business models have not fully evolved and matured yet.
Yeah.
Right now, that doesn't automatically mean that a non-profit play is much better than a for-profit one, because a non-profit still needs to think about its own sustainability. It needs to think about where does it get funding for doing whatever work it's looking to do. Right. So that's not always an easy trade-off to make. So I think that there are some places where a revenue model is almost impossible. Right from the outset, you can see that there is no possibility of gaining revenues.
Can you share some examples, maybe in some areas where it's not possible and where it is possible?
Yeah, sure. So I think if you look at e-governance foundation, I think it's a classic example. Again, they are an older organization, but I think that it's still instructive to look at their model. What they provide is a technology backbone and a platform for municipalities, as I've described. Right? Now, when we look at the complexity of tendering out and buying solutions of this nature, it's definitely so complex that sort of following a for-profit model where you're expecting that a market is actually going to work is quite unrealistic at this point. Maybe 10, 15 years down the road, things might look different, or some years down the road, things might look different. But at this point, it's essentially too complex to assume that a market-based model can work. That's one of the reasons. But also the second thing is what eGov is doing is to build what we think of as sector infrastructure. Right? So this is infrastructure that other people can benefit on top of. What do I mean by that? So essentially what they're building is an open source platform, which other people can then come in and build their own solutions on top of. So, and that's where there could be interesting for-profit approaches to be taken. Right? So, for example, once the basic core infrastructure is put in place, for somebody else to come in and build on top of that and say, there's an interesting dashboard that I can build that will make government's life easier. Now that starts to become a smaller, more tightly scoped solution, which you can start to imagine a government buying. Right? So that's where I would contrast the possibility of a for-profit model versus a not-for-profit one. I think it would sort of cleave along dimensions like that, if that makes sense.
Also, what is it that the entrepreneurs need to have to jump in this sector? Is it enough to have tech expertise? Let's say if I'm an aspiring entrepreneur and I know blockchain and I have proficiency in artificial intelligence, I know machine learning, my team knows it in and out. Is it enough to jump into Civic Tech, or do you need prior experience of working with the government or having an interface with government processes? What profile of entrepreneurs would you want to see in this sector, and would you want or would you expect to succeed in such models?
Yeah, I think given the nascent nature of the sector, Snehal, I think it requires people who, first of all, have a great degree of passion for solving the kind of problem that they are looking to solve. Right. So I think it requires people to come in with the mindset that says, look, I'm here to solve the following problem. Not so much looking at it from a technology mindset per se, so not so much saying, look, my expertise is in blockchain or whatever else, and therefore I want to get in here. But instead of saying, look, air pollution is something that I feel passionate about solving for, or waste management or whatever else. Because frankly, I think it's going to be a long journey, because again, it is a nascent space. Models are not yet figured out. I don't expect that the going will be very easy, and therefore, if you're not guided by a clear North Star, where you're saying, this is the big problem that I feel passionate about, committing a few years of my life to solving, then it might be easier to sort of get tired or lose hope, versus someone who's really deeply committed to solving the problem. So that is probably what I would say is the first point on which you should anchor yourself.
When we talk to entrepreneurs, they often share that the ecosystem of Civic Tech is not there. There are not enough investors. The process of procurement is pretty tedious. Tendering is a very different world altogether, where probably startups don't fit in. What's your take on that? And if you can talk more on what is lacking in the ecosystem right now, what is stopping entrepreneurs to innovate in Civic Tech right now?
Yeah. No, it's quite true, Snehal, that I think that there are a few gaps at the moment. Perhaps primary among those would be, given the fact that it is the government that is the primary customer here for most Civic Techs. The question is, how effective is the government as a customer to begin with, right? And this would come back to procurement policies, as you just described. If something is extremely sophisticated technology, then the government will understandably struggle to procure it, because tendering norms are not clear. If I'm a conservative bureaucrat, then I struggle to think about how to even sort of convince people about the fact that a certain piece of technology that I bought was necessary. Right? So those kinds of barriers will come up. And so I do think that those are things that one needs to be mindful of as one is venturing down this path. That I think is frankly perhaps the biggest set of constraints at the moment. So I think the way that we've been advising entrepreneurs that are looking to set up in this sphere is to also say, how can you diversify your potential revenue base outside of just government? So your civic solutions might be things that you're selling to government, but are there other potential customers as well? Could a business customer buy your solution? Could citizens directly procure your solutions, or through some kind of an aggregated play, right? So for example, if you're doing some water purification system or something like that, could you be selling it to apartment complexes in addition to taking it to the municipal body, right? So those kinds of approaches where you're saying, look, I do want to diversify my customer base and not going to rely only on government are really important. And without that, it's very hard to see how you can gain quick traction. But I think, yeah, those are some of the barriers for sure. And therefore, I've also talked a little bit about sort of how you should be thinking about countering those.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, how to address the less number of investors in the sector? Um, is it because there is less information, there is less knowledge or awareness? Is it about uh, investors are more risk averse in investing in this sector? How can we solve this? How can we turn this around?
Yeah, I do think that as I think it's a function of many different things, right? I mean, I think that as more and more entrepreneurs get in, as there is more excitement around solutions that are being built in this space, as business models emerge, as the government itself becomes a more sophisticated customer, as we get better at figuring out other potential customers, citizens directly, sort of private sector businesses, and so on. All of those will add to the momentum in it. I don't think this is something where an investor is sort of sitting on the sidelines because they are not informed about it, or they don't want to get in. I think it's much more of the fact that, once something really attractive emerges, then investors will also inevitably start to look at it. I think it's also fair to say that in some cases, for an entrepreneur that's getting into the space, bootstrapping and looking to not raise externally might not be a bad idea. So looking to grow at a more measured pace, where you're actually thinking of saying, hey, how can I bootstrap for at least the next 3 to 4 years, is probably a sensible way to approach the sector, because exactly as you're saying, investors are not sort of lining up at the moment. And therefore, for someone coming in where they're saying, hey, I'm going to attract investors from day one, is probably not a realistic assumption. And therefore, thinking of bootstrap models also probably forces you to think a little bit harder about the sustainability of the business right from day one.
But if the startups, and as you just mentioned, if the startups are exploring multiple revenue streams in addition to government clients, is there a risk of shifting from Civic Tech to just being a private play entrepreneur? Have you seen any such examples, or have you seen multiple revenue streams actually working out? Or if you can share some examples in that.
Yeah. No, I think it is definitely a risk, and which is why I would say that, I mean, ultimately it's the entrepreneur who needs to decide that, right? I mean, if they find that the journey of being sort of a pure play, quote unquote, civic tech startup is not fulfilling to them, then of course they are going to pivot and move to a different space. This is why I also said that, I think the passion in solving the problem is a very important one. But of course, there's ultimately the reality of having to build a business, and if that means you have to pivot to a different space, then so be it. I don't think the purity of the model is something we should be too hung up about, because I do think that ultimately, as long as you're solving an important problem, whether you're solving it in sort of one dimension or another one, I wouldn't be too sort of fussed about that. So yeah, that is one aspect of it. So yeah, I think that's maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. One last question before we move to the final section, which is an exciting rapid fire section. In your personal capacity, what do you think have been your biggest breakthroughs in Civic Tech in last 2 to 4 years? Any instances, anecdotes, or interventions which you believe have been really successful from your end?
Yeah, I think certainly. A couple of things that I would mention. First of all, we are a very selective investor, so we are not going to have a large number of investments to point to where I can say that here are huge breakthroughs that we've made, and that's by design. That is how we are as an investor. But at the same time, I think the energy that I have noticed in the sector over the last couple of years, in particular, it's actually been very interesting to see and been very palpable. I think that is what we noticed back when we partnered with Village Capital to set up an accelerator, and then of course we partnered with you as well towards the end of that to document some of our findings from that accelerator work. I think across all of which we certainly saw the sense of momentum that was starting to build. Again, as I said, it is a nascent space, but at least the momentum starting to build. Governments becoming more ready than ever before. government starting to talk about some of the policies that will be needed here, modified procurement policies, open data policies, all of those things, which were, they would have been somewhat pipe dreams even a couple of years back. I think the fact that many of those building blocks are starting to come in place is really exciting for us. State governments that are saying, this is an important area for us. All of those are changes that have happened only over the past, several months now. And so, yeah, for me, it's all of those that I would point to as being, what's been most fulfilling for me as I look back on this journey over the last 2 years or thereabouts.
Okay. Also, a question which is also coming from some audience members is uh, if you can share some examples of any dual models where there have been both for-profit and non-profit arms and which have succeeded. Have you seen them, and what's the reason they succeeded?
That's a tough one, to be honest. I think that many times people do think that, if a for-profit model is not working, let me switch to a non-profit one and so on. I think that you sometimes need to examine that from the point of view of first principles and to say, where is my revenue likely to come from over here, right? If it is likely to be foundations or grant makers who are going to be providing grants to help you build a certain area out, then you should be looking to structure as a non-profit. But if you do think that there is a market opportunity and there are customers that you can tap into, that's where the for-profit side comes in. I can't think of any very successful example where someone has straddled both those worlds. But with that said, I think there are places starting to emerge where even non-profits are starting to say, look, I know that I can't be fully sustainable just from grants alone. So is there an asset that I can take and start to monetize in a certain way, right? So which is starting to get to some of essentially this blended model. So I do think that more of that might start to emerge, but I don't think it's common at this point where one can say that here are examples of a blended model that is working.
Okay. I have a few questions, very quick fire questions for you, and I'll also try to incorporate a few of the viewer questions in this. How many civic tech startups do you foresee in India in next 5 years?
I'm hoping they'll number in the hundreds, to be honest. I don't have a crystal ball where I can say. Okay. But yeah, I would definitely hope it would be in the hundreds. Just and where I come from when I say that is just given the scale of the civic problems that we have, in sector after sector, water, sanitation, pollution, all of these require innovative solutions, which frankly, I think, when we look at what can come from the startup community, it'll be very hard to come from somewhere else. Right? So that's the reason I believe they should number in that quantity. But of course, that would require all of the barriers to be addressed, which we've talked about.
And how many of these hundreds of startups do you expect to be for-profit business models?
My guess is that many of them will be, to be honest, because I think that it is possible to build robust businesses here. We have certainly seen at least a dozen or so for-profit models emerging. Again, they probably need to be run by patient entrepreneurs who can bootstrap to begin with, but yeah, probably the majority of them.
Okay. What are the different funding models which startups can explore, be it venture debt, be it equity, be it grants? What is more suitable to which kind of problems or business models? Or is it dependent on the kind of problem they are solving? Is it dependent on the kind of model which they have? Can you talk a little about that?
It really depends on the model as well as the problem that they're looking to solve. It's a combination of both. So, for example, if you're looking to solve a problem where the gestation period is quite high, you're not going to be able to raise revenues from customers right away. It probably also means that investors might shy away from it to begin with. Right? So there the question would be, is there some kind of a blended financial model where you can rely on grants upfront? That would be a useful avenue to look at. And we have actually seen a few models of that kind from a blended finance perspective, right? Where there are operations that have been set up which are primarily reliant on grants to begin with, where you sort of take a problem to a non-profit funder and actually get grants from them to get started, and then actually start over time to realize that there is a customer base for it, and you can build a more robust for-profit model.
Okay. And also, how many startups do you think Omidia network is going to invest?
Hopefully a few. It's always a hard one to answer, but yeah, again, for the reasons that I mentioned, I feel like this is a very important sector, which is going to contribute dramatically to the solution of a lot of really important problems. So I do hope that we find and invest in a few startups in this space.
Okay, okay. Are there any specific subsectors or areas within Civic Tech which you believe will see a major growth in next few years?
Not particularly, to be honest, Nehil, because I think that across all of the areas that we look at under Civic Tech, I think that all of them have the same challenges and the same opportunities, right? So I don't think there's any one in particular that I would call out and say this is something I'm expecting to break out in the near future.
Let's say,
yes.
let's say if we see startups in terms of working at the front end with the governments on uh, sectors like waste or sanitation or utilities, uh, versus startups who are working at the back end, like e-government foundation. Uh, which of these would you see will grow more, will attract more innovation or tech interventions?
Yeah, if you make that cutoff, probably the front end startups a little bit more. Because of the fact that clearly service delivery expectations of citizens continue to grow by the day, and therefore the ability to or the requirement of bringing in innovation and solving those problems clearly also keeps growing by the day, and therefore hopefully models will start to emerge a little bit more quickly there.
Okay. And what about startups startups working on citizen engagement with the government, where probably there is no strong revenue model. They can't charge the citizens hefty prices, and they might shift to non-profit models maybe. What's your take on that? Will they see more entrepreneurs coming in, or will it still continue to be a sector which will need hand-holding from grants?
Yeah, I my gut feel is that it will probably be a slightly more grant oriented sector. But I do think that, again, interesting models could start to emerge there, where they could be sort of micro payment based, small payments that are more like fees that people are able to charge citizens. I think, some models are starting to emerge there. Again, those could start to scale up a little bit more attractively. I mean, intuitively, I think that they seem to be more amenable to grant based approaches, but I think even their business models could emerge.
Okay, okay. Also, for our viewers, can you throw some moonshot areas where any subsectors or areas where you haven't seen any action till now, but which might sprout up in next 2 to 5 years? Uh, is there anything which you see in that regard?
Yeah, that's a hard one as well to call one or two out in that space, Nehal. But I do think that, given the momentum that has been established in the last couple of years, a lot of such areas could emerge in the future. Again, it's going to require a lot of the hard work of actually building up these spaces. But I do think that, again, for entrepreneurs that have the passion to solve problems in this space, I do think that now is a good time to be jumping in. I don't know if any of them will emerge as moonshots in the next, as legitimate moonshots in terms of success areas in the next couple of years. But in terms of the nature of the problem, I think almost everything in the civic tech space is an exciting moonshot to be sort of taking aim at.
Okay. And any areas where you haven't seen much action till now, and maybe you have always thought that why don't you see entrepreneurs in solving these set of problems? Are there any such areas? And maybe you can share some examples for our viewers here.
No, I've actually been pleasantly surprised to see that, in most spaces. So let's take waste as an example, water, sanitation. Lots of really interesting, exciting ideas coming up. People looking at saying, how can we apply new technologies towards cleaning up polluted lakes or cleaning up effluents from sewage treatment plants and so on.
Right.
Or to cleaning up water supplies that are going into apartment complexes. On a lot of these, it's been amazing to see the kinds of innovations that entrepreneurs have started coming up with. So I don't think there's one area that I can point to and say it hasn't. I mean, maybe pollution is probably one, right? Where you can say just given the extent of what we deal with in the country. Um, a really sort of breakthrough solution that can help solve problems there, I guess, both water and air pollution. Perhaps that would be one. But even there, I mean, definitely on the water side, certainly there are a lot of interesting ideas that have come up in the past couple of years. Maybe not yet gotten to the scale that at which the impact can be really dramatic, but hopefully we'll get there soon.
Okay. What view do you have on government initiatives? Let's say Smart City Mission or Startup India. Have they been able to boost civic tech action in some way, uh, or still a lot of work needs to be done there to integrate civic tech into these?
No, definitely. I think there is certainly a lot of work to be done. But I think that as I look at the past couple of years, given the whole push on the approach towards bringing more digital into government, whether we call it Digital India or whether there's a different name it might go by in other states, but the fact is that that has started to become a movement that has gained a fair bit of traction, and therefore I think that is one of the things that has created the enabling environment that we've seen over the last few years. So, and I don't see any of these as being one silver bullet solution. Just because there is a smart cities program, it doesn't mean that things are automatically going to get a lot better. But I do think that all of those as programs and ideas have contributed. So, we have come across startups that have built interesting businesses on the back of smart cities programs. People, for example, who are developing sensors and who are putting those sensors to be able to assess flooding when it happens in a particular city. They've actually been able to build. They've been able to win contracts from smart city programs and therefore build at least a small but viable business on the back of it. So I think all of these as initiatives have helped. I don't see any of them as silver bullets, but I think each of them is an important one in its own way and has contributed overall to the environment.
Yeah. Probably one last question, because we have overshot time as well. How should we measure the success of startups in this sector? And this is a question where a lot of investors get stuck. That how do we get returns, or is return the right metrics to look at this sector? How would you define success of a startup in civic tech?
No, I do think that different people who are looking at it will have different answers to that. I think that that's inevitable. From my perspective, what I would say is that the impact that by creating a startup in the space and by helping it grow and expand, the impact that can end up having on the lives of large numbers of people is really what I would be looking to. And there's a number of things that are wrapped into that, right? Because it is being able to build a business model, being able to attract investors, being able to attract customers. It's all of those things that would be wrapped into it. So ultimately, that's what I would like to see. I think that many individuals who are stakeholders in the space might have different answers to it. But really, what I would love to see is the potential for actually solving problems at scale that can really impact the lives of millions of people already in our country, maybe even hundreds of millions of people. If that promise is in some ways even fulfilled, even to a small extent, I think that could be a really sort of powerful journey.
Yeah. I tend to assume that I have covered a lot of stuff, but would leave it to you to maybe share if you have anything else in your mind to maybe close it.
No, I think we've covered most of the areas that I think are important in this space, Nehal. But I do think that it is an exciting space. It's great to see the entrepreneurial energy that we have already seen here. And I would definitely encourage more of it to happen, because again, the scale of the problems are so vast that it is really crying out for innovative solutions. And so it's already heartening to see the progress and the energy that there has been in the space. But I would love to see even more on that dimension.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Bharat. We really got to know several insightful perspectives today. Thank you for sharing your heart out. And looking forward to see more civic tech action. Hoping for more investors and more ecosystem builders to come into the picture in next couple of years. And totally agree with the fact that there are so many enablers for the sector right now, be it in technology, push for digitization, the plethora of problems which are there, which are still unsolved. That is a huge universe of opportunities right now. So yes, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And to the viewers, I would just like to say that this is our first fireside chat, and we are planning more. So stay tuned with the CIA Co's action on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. We'll come up with more sectoral deep dives and more sectoral conversations in coming few weeks. And thank you so much, Bharat, for taking time out and having such a candid sharing of thoughts today.
Thanks so much, Snehal. Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. See you all.